Shut down that locomotive or face charges. The railroad CEO's voice crackled, a stark command cutting through the chill, as Ray loaded freezing passengers onto his makeshift rescue train. Only yesterday they'd dismissed his grandfather's private railroad as an obsolete relic. Now, with 229 lives precariously hanging in the balance, Ray faced an impossible choice: obey the order and abandon them, or defy it and finish the desperate mission he had only just begun. This impossible dilemma was rooted in a rapidly worsening crisis. Ray Harmon's gaze was fixed on the relentless wall of snow rapidly building on the horizon. At 60, he had weathered enough Montana winters to recognize the ominous signs of a truly formidable storm, and this one promised to be devastating. Though the radio warned of the worst blizzard in 15 years, Ray, having watched the brooding clouds all morning, knew instinctively it would be far, far worse. His trusty ranch hand, Miguel, pulled his truck up to the barn where Ray was diligently checking supplies. "Got the south pasture herd into the protected valley," Miguel called out, his voice thick with concern. "You really think this storm's going to hit as bad as they're saying?" "Worse," Ray replied, his breath momentarily crystallizing in the cold air. "Better get home to your family. This one's going to lock everything down for days." As Miguel drove away, a new, critical concern seized Ray's attention, demanding immediate care before the storm's full fury descended. The railroad. To most people, the very notion of a private railroad slicing through a cattle ranch in the 21st century seemed utterly preposterous. Yet it was undeniably there. 5 miles of standard gauge track, a gleaming ribbon of steel cutting across Ray's land, connecting directly to a mountain pass that led to the main line on the other side. Ray's grandfather had meticulously built it in the 1920s, a time when trains were the sole reliable means of transporting cattle to market. While most ranchers would have long ago ripped up the tracks, selling the steel for scrap and reclaiming the land for grazing, Ray Harmon was not most ranchers. For 3 generations, his family had steadfastly maintained those tracks, ensuring they remained fully operational. Ray himself still used them occasionally, moving heavy equipment and vast hay bales across his sprawling property with an old locomotive he'd lovingly rescued from a scrapyard 2 decades prior. He had restored the iron beast himself, learning every bolt and gear as he went, keeping it running by fabricating parts in his machine shop when original components simply couldn't be found. As Ray gazed into the rapidly approaching storm, memories of his grandfather's stories resurfaced. He remembered vividly the tales of pulling stranded ranchers to safety on these very tracks during the infamous '47 snowstorm. "We don't wait for permission to do what's right," his grandfather had declared. Ray had been only 7 years old then, but those powerful words had resonated deeply, shaping his outlook throughout his entire life. The railroad wasn't merely a collection of steel and wood. It was a vital lifeline, a legacy his family had diligently maintained for generations. The County Historical Society had been hounding him for years, urging him to transform it into a tourist attraction. Living history, they called it. The state had even dangled grants, offering funds to convert it into a scenic railway. But Ray had consistently declined every offer. This was no novelty or museum piece. This was a working railroad, a functional entity, and he was resolute in his intention to keep it that way. In preparation for the worsening conditions, Ray climbed into his truck and drove slowly along the service road that ran parallel to the tracks, meticulously checking for any potential issues that might demand attention before the blizzard struck. He reached the switch point, the crucial junction where his private spur seamlessly connected to the main mountain pass line, his focus unwavering. He noticed the mechanism was already gathering a dangerous layer of ice. Grabbing his tools, he diligently spent the next 30 minutes cleaning and greasing it, ensuring its functionality even under the most brutal freezing conditions. As he worked, his radio crackled to life with the latest weather update. The National Weather Service had just upgraded the blizzard warning, now predicting 3 to 4 feet of snow in the valleys, with even more in the mountains, accompanied by winds approaching 60 miles per hour. "Going to be a rough one," Ray muttered, the words barely audible over the rising wind. By the time he returned to the ranch house, snow was already falling, a prelude to the whiteout. He swiftly stoked the fire in the wood stove, checked his generator, and made sure his satellite phone was fully charged. Regular cell service was unreliable on a good day out here. In a storm like this, it would be non-existent. That night, the storm hit with all the anticipated fury. The wind howled around the eaves of his house, driving snow into monumental drifts that quickly engulfed his porch. He slept fitfully, waking every few hours to add more wood to the roaring stove. By morning, the world beyond his windows had vanished, consumed by a swirling, impenetrable white void. Ray was in the kitchen, brewing coffee, when his satellite phone rang. The display clearly showed Sheriff Davis. "Morning, Tom," Ray answered, his voice steady despite the chaos outside. "Ray, we've got a situation," Sheriff Davis began, his voice grim. "That passenger train from Seattle to Chicago, it's stranded on the other side of Elk Pass." Ray slowly set his coffee cup down. "How long?" "Engine problems started last night. They made it through the first part of the pass, but stalled about 4 miles from the eastern tunnel exit. They've got over 200 passengers on board, including families with kids and some elderly folks." The sheriff paused, then continued. "Railroad's sending rescue equipment, but—" His sigh conveyed everything before he even spoke the words. "That's the problem. The main line's blocked by an avalanche about 20 miles west of their position. Railroad's mobilizing equipment from the east, but with the interstate closed and the conditions, they won't get there today." Ray finished the thought for him. "Or tomorrow." "Exactly," Tom confirmed. "The train's got emergency generators running lights and some heat, but fuel's limited. They're rationing it now." Ray stared out at the relentless blizzard, a stark, white canvas. "What are they asking me to do?" "Nothing yet. This is me. Calling you, not them. Railroad's still working through their protocols, but I know about your spur line, Ray, and I know it connects to the pass just west of where they're stranded." Ray understood immediately what the sheriff was suggesting. His railroad, his grandfather's railroad, might be the only accessible route to the stranded passengers. "My locomotive could get through the pass from this side," Ray said, thinking aloud, a plan already forming in his mind. "The line's been maintained." "That old steam engine of yours still running?" the sheriff asked, a hint of surprise in his voice. "She's not steam. She's a 1950s diesel electric, and yes, she runs fine," Ray corrected, a touch of pride in his voice. He had, after all, spent countless hours in his machine shop, meticulously keeping the old locomotive operational. Most people simply thought it was a quaint hobby, an old man's eccentric passion project. They didn't truly understand that Ray believed profoundly in having backup systems, robust solutions that didn't depend entirely on the fragile infrastructure of modern times. "I'll mention it," the sheriff said. "I'll mention it to the railroad emergency coordinator when I speak to him next," the sheriff said, a flicker of hope in his voice. "Just wanted to know if it was even possible before I brought it up." "It's possible," Ray confirmed, his gaze still fixed on the swirling whiteout. "Whether they'll want help from an old rancher with a private railroad is another question entirely." After hanging up, Ray pulled on his heaviest winter gear and headed straight to the barn, where his snowcat, a rugged tracked vehicle designed for traversing deep snow, awaited. He needed to check his railroad line to confirm it was truly passable. A journey that normally took 20 minutes by truck stretched into over an hour in the snowcat, a relentless battle against the raging blizzard. Ray meticulously followed the path of his railroad, stopping occasionally to clear snow from crucial switch points or to inspect the condition of the rails. Despite the brutal conditions, the line was holding up remarkably well. His diligent fall maintenance had truly paid off. When he finally reached the junction where his private spur met the main mountain pass line, Ray idled the snowcat, pausing to carefully consider the perilous situation. From this point, it was approximately 7 miles through the pass to where the passenger train was reportedly stranded. The pass itself was notoriously tricky even in good conditions, characterized by steep grades, 2 unforgiving tunnels, and a precarious curved trestle bridge spanning Weber Canyon. Attempting a rescue with heavy equipment in the midst of a blizzard would be, to put it mildly, an extraordinary challenge. His satellite phone rang again, pulling him from his thoughts. This time it wasn't the sheriff. "Mr. Harmon, this is Stanley Whitaker, Emergency Operations Director for Western Rail. Sheriff Davis suggested I contact you directly. He mentioned you might call." "I did," Ray replied, his tone even. "We understand you maintain a private rail line that connects to our mountain route near the western entrance to Elk Pass. Is that correct?" Whitaker inquired, a clear note of skepticism in his voice. "It has been, ever since my grandfather built it in 1925, Ray responded, cutting straight to the point. "And you have operational equipment? Rolling stock. I've got a functioning locomotive and 3 cattle cars converted for equipment transport, plus a caboose I use as a mobile workshop," Ray listed, a subtle defiance in his tone. There was a noticeable pause on the line. Ray could almost hear the railroad executive's disbelief. "Mr. Harmon, we're dealing with a serious situation. We have passengers stranded in deteriorating conditions." "I'm aware," Ray said, his voice calm and steady. "I'm at the junction point now, checking the line condition. It's passable. My equipment can reach your train within 3 hours. Weather permitting." Another, longer pause followed. "You're suggesting a private citizen with non-certified equipment attempt a rescue operation in blizzard conditions through a mountain pass?" Whitaker finally asked, incredulity lacing his words. "I'm suggesting I can get to your passengers before your equipment can. The choice is yours." "Mr. Harmon, while we appreciate your concern, Western Rail has established protocols for emergency situations. We have specialized equipment being routed from our eastern depot. It's simply a matter of time," Ray interrupted, his voice hardening slightly. "Which those passengers don't have. Your specialized equipment is on the wrong side of closed roads and blocked tracks. I'm 8 miles away with a working locomotive. I understand your position, but there are liability issues, regulatory considerations. There are people, Habafisma, who might freeze to death, Ray said bluntly, his voice cutting through the executive's excuses. But you do what you need to do. I'll be ready if you change your mind. Ray ended the call and, with a grim determination, turned the snowcat back towards his ranch. He had preparations to make, regardless of what the railroad ultimately decided. Back at his machine shop, Ray began gathering essential supplies. If he was truly going to attempt this audacious rescue, he'd need far more than just his locomotive. He methodically loaded tools, a stack of emergency blankets, comprehensive first aid kits, and a generous supply of food onto his utility snowmobile. His satellite phone rang 4 more times over the next 2 hours, each call from the railroad executive, replete with more questions, more concerns, and more elaborate reasons why Ray's offer simply couldn't be accepted. By mid-afternoon, the dire situation had escalated. The train's generators were dangerously low on fuel, and temperatures inside the passenger cars were plummeting rapidly. Several elderly passengers were already showing clear signs of hypothermia, and a child with asthma was struggling with breathing difficulties. Ray was in his shop, meticulously working on a fuel transfer pump, when the door suddenly burst open, ushering in a swirling vortex of snow and a figure bundled against the biting cold. "Sheriff," Ray acknowledged, nodding as Tom Davis stomped snow from his boots. "Railroad still stalling," the sheriff said without preamble, his breath visible in the chilled air of the shop. "They're worried about liability, regulations, insurance." "While people are freezing," Ray finished, his voice flat. "Exactly. I've been on calls with the governor's office, emergency management. Everyone's pointing fingers about jurisdiction and responsibility." The sheriff removed his gloves and held his hands near Ray's shop heater, trying to warm them. "What are you getting ready for?" Ray gestured to the extensive equipment he had been methodically assembling. "What does it look like?" The sheriff's gaze swept over the supplies, then settled back on Ray. "Looks like you're planning to ignore the railroad and do this anyway." "Those tracks cross my property," Ray stated, his voice firm. "The junction is on my land. What I do with my equipment on my property is my business." The sheriff studied him for a long, silent moment. "You know, they'll try to stop you officially if they find out. Hard to stop with Ray replied, a glint in his eye. "Ray, I'm the sheriff. I can't officially know about this." "Then unofficially?" Ray pressed. "What do you know about the train situation?" The sheriff sighed, a heavy sound. "Unofficially? It's getting bad in there. Heat's minimal. They've got some medical situations developing. Railroad's still saying their equipment will get there by tomorrow afternoon." Ray checked his watch. "That's nearly 24 hours from now. Temperatures dropping to 15 below tonight." "I know," the sheriff conceded, then headed back to the door. "I never had this conversation with you, but if someone happened to bring those people some help before the official rescue, well, sometimes asking forgiveness is better than asking permission." After the sheriff left, Ray moved with a renewed, urgent purpose. He drove his snowcat to the engine shed where he kept his magnificent locomotive, a General Motors EMD GP9, built in 1954. He'd purchased it for mere scrap value when the railroad was decommissioning it, then spent years meticulously restoring it to full operational condition. The 1,250 horsepower diesel-electric engine had been built to last, a testament to robust engineering, designed for the punishing conditions of mountain railroading. Ray started the preheating process for the engine, meticulously checking every system. The locomotive roared to life, its diesel engine settling into a deep, powerful throb that echoed through the metal shed. On a normal day, he would have spent more time warming it up, but today wasn't normal. He slowly backed the locomotive out onto his main spur, connecting it to the two crucial cars he'd prepared. A converted cattle car, now surprisingly equipped with bench seating and heating stoves, and his indispensable caboose workshop. It was certainly not a passenger train by any conventional means, but it was robust and capable of safely transporting people in a dire emergency. The snow had slackened somewhat, but the wind still howled mercilessly across the open areas of his ranch. Ray scanned the horizon, his eyes sweeping for any unexpected visitors before he proceeded. The last thing he needed was a railroad official showing up to serve him with some kind of cease and desist order. With everything finally ready, Ray opened the throttle, and the magnificent locomotive began to move along his private tracks, steadily gaining momentum as it lumbered toward the distant junction. In the caboose, he had carefully loaded medical supplies, thick blankets, nourishing food, and clean water. If the railroad wouldn't officially sanction a rescue, he would do it anyway. The journey to the junction went smoothly, almost eerily so, despite the brutal conditions. Ray's rigorous fall maintenance had paid off handsomely, with the tracks remaining clear enough for safe passage. As he approached the junction, he carefully slowed the locomotive, peering through the swirling snow, his heart sinking at what he saw. A Western rail truck was parked squarely across the tracks at the junction point, its headlights cutting through the storm like accusing eyes. A lone figure, bundled in a company parka, stood beside it, waving frantically for Ray to stop. Ray brought the powerful locomotive to a halt about 50 yards from the junction. He climbed down from the cab, pulling his coat tighter against the biting, relentless wind. "Harmon, stand down!" the railroad official shouted, his voice a strained battle against the gale as Ray approached. "I have direct orders from Mr. Sullivan himself. You are not authorized to proceed." "People are freezing on that train," Ray countered, his voice carrying over the wind, imbued with an unshakable resolve. "Your equipment won't get there in time." "That's not your concern. This is Western Rail property and jurisdiction. If you proceed, the company will seize your equipment and press charges." Ray looked past the man to the junction switch. It would take him less than a minute to throw it and connect his spur to the main line. The railroad man seemed to read his thoughts, stepping directly in front of the switch mechanism, blocking his path. "Don't even think about it, Harmon. I'm authorized to use whatever means necessary to prevent unauthorized access to the line." Ray studied the man's face. He was young, probably a mid-level manager who'd drawn the short straw for this impossible assignment. He didn't look like he wanted to be standing in a blizzard any more than Ray wanted him there. "What's your name?" Ray asked, his voice calm despite the rising tension. The question seemed to catch the man off guard. "Peterson. James Peterson." "Well, Mr. Peterson," Ray began, his gaze unwavering, "I've got a simple question for you. When you..." "Report back that you stopped me." Are you prepared to explain to the families of anyone who doesn't make it through the night that you were just following orders? Peterson's confident stance visibly faltered. That's not fair. The company is doing everything possible. Everything, Ray cut in, his voice unwavering, except accepting help that's available right now. Ray took a decisive step closer. I'm not asking for permission, Mr. Peterson. I'm going through that junction now. You can either help me throw that switch or you can stand there and watch me do it, but I'm not turning back. For a long, tense moment, neither man moved, the wind howling mercilessly around them, snow rapidly accumulating on their shoulders. Then, Peterson looked away, his shoulders slumping ever so slightly. I was never here, he said finally, his voice barely a whisper as he stepped away from the switch. I got stuck in a drift and couldn't reach the junction. By the time I got my truck free, you were already gone. Ray nodded, a hint of grim satisfaction in his eyes. Sounds like a reasonable report to me. Peterson retreated to his truck as Ray swiftly threw the switch, feeling the satisfying click as it connected his spur to the mountain pass line. As Ray climbed back into his locomotive, Peterson rolled down his window. Good luck, Harmon. Those people need it. This was the point of no return. Once he took his locomotive onto Western Rail's tracks, he would be trespassing on railroad property, violating an untold number of regulations and laws. Ray hesitated for only a moment, a fleeting breath before opening the throttle again. The locomotive surged forward, its immense power pushing it on to the main line, beginning the relentless climb into Elk Pass. The pass itself was a challenging route even in the best conditions. In a blizzard with severely limited visibility, it was nothing short of treacherous. Ray prudently reduced speed, relying on his intimate knowledge of the route and the locomotive's powerful headlamp to navigate the swirling chaos. The first tunnel came quickly, a quarter-mile passage through solid rock that provided a brief, blessed respite from the howling wind and relentless blowing snow. Emerging from the other side, Ray immediately faced the most difficult section, a deeply curved trestle bridge spanning the vast expanse of Weber Canyon. He slowed the locomotive to a crawl, meticulously guiding it across the ice-covered structure. Every creak and groan of the bridge was transmitted through the locomotive's frame, but the solid construction, a testament to his grandfather's foresight, held firm. The second tunnel was longer, nearly a mile of oppressive darkness broken only by the piercing beam of the locomotive's headlamp. Ray checked his portable GPS unit, estimating he was about 3 miles from the stranded train's position. As he finally exited the tunnel onto a relatively straight section of track, Ray could clearly see it. The faint, weak lights of the passenger train glowing weakly in the distance, surrounded by towering snowdrifts that nearly reached the windows of the cars. He brought his locomotive to a stop about 50 yards from the stranded train and grabbed his satellite phone. "Sheriff, it's Ray. I've reached the train. Going to make contact now." "Officially, I have no idea what you're talking about," the sheriff replied, his voice laced with unspoken approval. "Good luck." Ray bundled up against the brutal cold and began to make his way through thigh-deep snow toward the passenger train. As he approached, he could discern figures moving inside the dim cars, desperate for help. He could clearly discern faces pressing against the frosted windows, people pointing in bewildered surprise at the unexpected arrival. A conductor, his uniform barely visible beneath layers of bulky winter clothing, forced open a door on the nearest car. "Who the hell are you?" the man shouted, his voice strained against the wind's roar. "Ray Harmon," Ray replied, his words precise and clear. "I've got a locomotive and 2 cars on the other side of the pass. I can evacuate your most vulnerable passengers." The conductor stared at him in utter disbelief. "Where did you come from? The railroad said rescue equipment was still a day away." "I've got a private line that connects to the pass," Ray explained, not waiting for an official invitation, as he climbed up into the frigid train car. "How bad is it in here?" Inside, the situation was far worse than Ray had imagined. The car was bone-chillingly cold, the air thick with visible breath. Passengers huddled together under blankets, many wearing every article of clothing they owned, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and cold. "Generator's almost out of fuel," the conductor explained, leading Ray through the crowded car. "We're down to emergency lighting only. No heat, except what people are generating themselves. We've got some medical situations in the next car." The train's crew had done their best, gathering the most vulnerable passengers into a single car to concentrate what little body heat remained. An elderly woman sat wrapped in layers of blankets, visibly shivering despite her efforts to stay warm. Nearby, a mother tightly held a young child who wheezed with each breath, his asthma severely aggravated by the pervasive cold. "How many passengers total?" Ray asked, his mind already calculating. 217 plus 12 crew. Ray did quick mental calculations. His converted cattle car, though rudimentary, could safely transport perhaps 40 people at a time. The most vulnerable would need to go first. "I can take 40 now," he announced. "Priority to medical cases, the elderly and children." He looked directly at the conductor. "I'll come back for more if conditions allow." "The railroad hasn't authorized this," the conductor said hesitantly, torn between protocol and compassion. "People are suffering," Ray countered, his voice firm. "Are you really going to wait? For paperwork?" The conductor looked around at the shivering, desperate passengers, then back at Ray. He made his decision. "Let's do this." Word spread quickly through the train, a ripple of cautious hope. The conductor and train staff immediately began identifying the most urgent cases for the first evacuation. Within 20 minutes, they had carefully selected 40 passengers. The frail elderly, families with small children, and those with pressing medical concerns. Getting them from the stranded train to Ray's locomotive was the next formidable challenge. The snow between the 2 trains was deep and treacherously uneven. Ray and 2 train staff members immediately set to work, creating a passable path by stomping down the heavy snow. Then, one by one, they painstakingly helped passengers make the difficult, slow journey from their cold, stranded train to Ray's waiting locomotive and the converted cattle car. The elderly woman, suffering from hypothermia, had to be carefully carried on an improvised stretcher. The asthmatic child was bundled in multiple blankets and carried tenderly by his father. Others stumbled through the deep snow, clutching whatever meager belongings they could carry, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and relief. Once all 40 passengers were safely loaded into the converted car, Ray personally checked that the heating stoves were working properly, radiating a much-needed warmth. It was far from luxury transportation, but with the immediate crisis, it was a sanctuary. Stoves going and emergency blankets distributed, it was far warmer than the powerless train they'd left behind. "I'll be back for more as soon as I can," Ray told the conductor, his voice firm. "Make sure the next group is ready." The return journey was slower and decidedly more tense, with vulnerable passengers aboard. Ray operated the locomotive with extreme caution, especially as they carefully crossed the curved trestle bridge. Inside the converted car, the train staff who had bravely come along to assist were doing their utmost to make the evacuees comfortable, offering reassuring words and distributing what little they had. Yet the journey was still harrowing, punctuated by the locomotive's groans and the relentless howl of the wind. Emerging from the treacherous pass onto Ray's private line felt like a profound victory. From here, it was a straight shot to his ranch, where the sheriff had, as promised, arranged for emergency vehicles to meet them. As they approached the ranch, Ray could clearly see the flashing lights of ambulances and other emergency vehicles waiting in the swirling snow. The sheriff had indeed come through, bringing medical personnel and transportation without ever officially acknowledging what Ray was doing. The first group of evacuees was quickly and efficiently transferred to ambulances and buses that would take them to the emergency shelter set up in the high school gymnasium. Ray took only enough time to refuel his steadfast locomotive before preparing for a second urgent trip. "Railroad's raising hell," the sheriff told him quietly as they watched the evacuees being loaded into vehicles. "They've figured out what's happening and are threatening everything from criminal charges to civil lawsuits. They can threaten all they want after everyone's safe," Ray replied, unwavering. "I'm heading back for the next group." The second trip went much more smoothly now that a path had been blazed through the snow. 40 more passengers were evacuated, then a third group. By midnight, Ray had managed to transport an astonishing 120 people from the stranded train to the safety of his ranch. As he prepared for a fourth trip, however, the weather took a dramatic turn for the worse. The wind picked up dramatically, driving snow horizontally across the landscape. Visibility dropped to near zero, becoming an impenetrable white wall. "It's getting too dangerous," the sheriff warned, his voice laced with concern, as Ray refueled the locomotive again. "Maybe wait until morning." "Still got nearly 100 people on that train," Ray said, methodically checking the locomotive systems. "They've been without heat for hours now. Morning might be too late for some of them." Before the sheriff could argue further, Ray's satellite phone rang. The display showed a number he didn't recognize. "Harmon," he answered, his voice firm. "Mr. Harmon, this is Gregory Sullivan, CEO of Western Rail." The voice was clipped, professional, with a barely controlled undercurrent of seething anger. "I understand you've taken it upon yourself to interfere with our emergency procedures. I understand you've left people to freeze while your lawyers worry about liability," Ray countered, his voice equally cold. "Our rescue equipment will arrive by morning," Sullivan insisted, his tone hardening. "Morning will be too late for some of those passengers. I've already evacuated 120 people, going back for the rest now." "Mr. Harmon, I'm officially ordering you to cease operations immediately. You are trespassing on railroad property, operating unauthorized equipment on our lines." "Listen carefully," Ray interrupted, his voice cutting through Sullivan's tirade like a sharp blade. "I'm going to get those people to safety. After that, you can have your lawyers throw whatever they want at me. But right now, I've got lives to save, and no more time to waste talking." Ray ended the call abruptly and climbed back into the locomotive cab. The sheriff watched him with a complex mixture of concern and admiration. "You know they're serious about those threats," he said, his voice hushed. "So am I about getting those people out," Ray replied, unwavering. He opened the throttle and the locomotive began to move once more, its powerful engine churning, heading back toward the mountain pass. The fourth journey was the most difficult yet. The strengthened storm created near whiteout conditions, forcing Ray to operate almost entirely by feel and memory, relying on every inch of his intimate knowledge of the track. The trestle bridge swayed visibly in the high winds, ice building rapidly on its metal supports, making every meter traversed a perilous gamble. By the time he reached the stranded train, conditions had deteriorated even further. The remaining passengers and crew were in dire shape, the temperature inside the cars now well below freezing. Working together with the exhausted crew, Ray managed to evacuate everyone who remained, cramming them into Ray's converted cattle car and even his small caboose. The return journey began as the first faint light of dawn attempted to break over the mountains, though it was barely visible through the continuing raging storm. Ray nursed the overloaded locomotive through the pass, acutely aware of the extra weight and the added strain on the venerable engine as they carefully crossed the groaning trestle bridge. When they finally cleared the pass and reached the relative sanctuary of his property, Ray saw something unexpected. A line of railroad vehicles had arrived and parked near his ranch house. Men in crisp Western Rail uniforms stood watching, their expressions unreadable as his locomotive slowly approached. Ray brought the train to a gentle stop near the waiting emergency vehicles. As the last of the weary passengers were carefully helped from the cars, a man in an expensive overcoat approached, flanked by several grim-faced railroad officials. "Mr. Harmon, I'm Gregory Sullivan." It was the CEO he'd spoken to on the phone, his face now a mask of controlled intensity. "We need to talk." Ray continued helping an elderly man down from the car, ignoring Sullivan for the moment. "After everyone's taken care of?" It took nearly an hour to get all the remaining passengers transferred to emergency vehicles and safely on their way to the shelter. Only then did Ray turn his full attention to the railroad officials waiting impatiently nearby. "You've placed my company in an impossible position, Mr. Harmon," Sullivan began, his voice cold and formal as Ray approached him. "Your unauthorized actions, while well-intentioned, have created enormous liability issues." "Did your official rescue equipment arrive yet?" Ray asked, his gaze direct and challenging. Sullivan had the grace to look distinctly uncomfortable. "It's been delayed further by road conditions." "Then it seems my unauthorized actions saved a lot of lives," Ray concluded, his voice unwavering. "That's not the point," Sullivan retorted, bristling. "That's exactly the point," Ray interrupted, his eyes flashing with conviction. "Everything else is just paperwork." The CEO studied Ray for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You realize we could pursue criminal charges, not to mention civil litigation that could cost you everything you own?" Ray looked past Sullivan to where his locomotive sat on the tracks, still humming with residual power, steam rising from its weary, warm engine into the cold air. His grandfather's railroad, the one everyone had told him was obsolete, impractical, a waste of time and resources to maintain. "Do what you have to do," Ray said simply. "I did." Sullivan sighed, some of the rigidity leaving his posture. "Actually, that's not why I'm here. Our legal department is certainly pushing for action. But—" He glanced toward the emergency vehicles disappearing down the road. 229 people are alive because of what you did. including my sister and her children who were on that train. Ray hadn't expected that revelation. I came to offer a different solution, Sullivan continued, his voice softening slightly. Western Rail would like to discuss a formal arrangement regarding your private line. Not interested in selling, Ray said immediately, his guard still up. This railroad stays with my ranch. I'm not talking about buying it. I'm proposing a cooperative agreement. Your line provides a valuable alternative. Route through the pass, one that could be vital in future emergencies. Ray studied the CEO's face, searching for any hidden catch. What kind of agreement? We provide resources for maintenance and upgrades to your track and equipment. You maintain operational control. In emergency situations, your line becomes an official alternative route, with you as the designated operator. It wasn't at all what Ray had expected. Not turning it into a tourist attraction? Sullivan shook his head. This would be a working emergency route, not a sightseeing operation, though I imagine there would be some public interest in what you've accomplished here. Over the next few weeks, as the region slowly recovered from the devastating blizzard and the extraordinary story of the ranch railroad rescue spread like wildfire, Ray found himself in an unfamiliar position. Being called a hero, news outlets eagerly picked up the compelling story, and suddenly, his private railroad was famous, a symbol of resilience and defiance. The grateful passengers he'd rescued organized a heartfelt thank you event at the high school gymnasium, where they shared moving stories of their harrowing experience and expressed their profound gratitude to Ray. The railroad made good on Sullivan's unexpected offer. A formal agreement was meticulously drawn up, officially designating Ray's line as an emergency alternative route, while leaving him firmly in control of its operation. Western Rail provided significant resources for track improvements and equipment maintenance, even arranging for Ray to acquire a reliable backup locomotive from their decommissioned stock. County officials who had previously pressured Ray to convert his beloved railroad into a mere tourist attraction now fully recognized its invaluable worth as vital, working infrastructure. The Historical Society still wanted to document its historical significance, but they no longer pushed to change its fundamental purpose. 3 months after the daring rescue, Ray stood watching as a crew of engineers diligently installed new signal equipment where his spur seamlessly joined the main line. His railroad now proudly appeared on official Western Rail emergency response maps, with his contact information prominently listed as the local route specialist. Sheriff Davis pulled up in his patrol car and got out, surveying the ongoing work with a knowing smile. Quite a change from them threatening to sue you, he observed wryly. Ray simply smiled. Ray nodded, a quiet satisfaction settling in. Turns out having something old-fashioned but functional has its advantages. You know, most people would have given in years ago, the sheriff mused. Turned it into a tourist train or sold it for scrap. Most people think newer always means better, Ray replied, his gaze following the line of newly installed signal equipment. Sometimes the old ways still work when modern systems fail. The sheriff looked down the line of track that disappeared into the distance, cutting through Ray's property just as it had when his grandfather built it nearly a century before. Your grandfather would be proud, the sheriff said, his voice soft but firm. Not just that you kept it running all these years, but what you did with it when it mattered most. Ray watched as the signal technicians tested the new equipment, lights blinking in sequence as they verified proper operation. His private railroad was no longer a mere curiosity or an anachronism. It had proven its worth in the most meaningful way possible, by saving lives when nothing else could. Sometimes, Ray thought, the most valuable things aren't those that change with every new trend. Sometimes they're the things that remain steadfast, maintained through generations, ready to serve when needed most, not as relics or museum pieces, but as working tools with purpose and dignity. His railroad was exactly where it belonged, still crossing his ranch, still connecting to the mountain pass, still ready to run when called upon. Not as a tourist attraction or historical,